Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if there was a scramble of Antarctica. Antarctica is the most forgotten continent of the world. Almost nothing grows there, very few people live there, most of them being scientists. It's the biggest desert of the world, and it was also the last continent that has been discovered. The temperatures in Antarctica, they are not really inviting, and thus permanent human settlements, well, they can only be established with a lot of efforts. Also, it is really isolated from the rest of the world. Chile and Argentina are the closest countries, but even the regions in the south of Chile and Argentina, Patagonia, is not really the most hospitable one. Antarctica was discovered in 1820 by a Russian expedition, whereas the first confirmed landing was done by Norwegians in 1895. Until the end of World War II, not many things have happened with Antarctica, but after World War II, the Antarctic Treaty has been established between many countries. But what if this never happened? What if there was a scramble of Antarctica? Let's say that the main reason to go and colonize Antarctica would be, you guessed it, right? Resources. According to some researchers and studies, Antarctica is very rich in silver, gold, cobalt, copper, coal, uranium, lead, nickel, oil, and much more. If that's not enough, then how about having some politicians who would claim that, oh yeah, since they already have Alaska or Siberia, Antarctica would just be very similar. And we are also in the middle of the Cold War, so why not just throw a bone in there and give this idea that, the US and Soviet Union should do something about it and have claims all over Antarctica before the other one, the rival, could set claims on this country, or well, actually this territory. And thus we would have also a situation where the one rival doesn't want that the other rival takes advantage, and thus both will try to have a fixed claim on Antarctica. In this ATL, this new Antarctic Treaty would be very different from the one that we have nowadays. This treaty would effectively and politically divide the continent between the US and the USSR. First and foremost, giving the Soviets a slight edge, because they were the first ones to discover the continent, being the successor state of the Russian Empire. The US would get a smaller part, but that would be enough because Argentina, Chile, Britain, France, Norway, Australia and New Zealand, they would also get their share, and they were more likely to be allies of the US. Instead of spending money into the space race, money would be spent into Antarctica. The USSR would take it very seriously and develop military bases, naval bases, and much more. Research stations would also be built. The next step would be to have better ships and bigger planes. Antonov planes could serve in this situation very well. While the Soviets were building and establishing themselves in Antarctica, the US would be shocked and have a similar reaction as in OTL, where they thought that the Soviets would be further ahead and have a huge advantage to them in terms of technology. The situation thus would be kind of similar, but only that in here there would be this huge investment to Antarctica instead of the space. The US would now also develop their Antarctic territory, but still be behind a few years or even a decade. The next powers to show some serious interest in Antarctica would be, of course, Chile, Argentina, Britain to some extent, and maybe even France. Due to the geographical situation, Chile and Argentina would have an easier time developing their part of the territory. They would even establish more serious settlements. Australia would send a few ships and perhaps even have research stations with New Zealand, while Norway would be more cautious and follow a policy for Antarctica that would be similar as in OTL. Not because they want to protect the environment, or maybe yes, they honestly care about the environment, but mostly because they were afraid of the Soviets. But on the other hand, they also don't want to somehow humiliate or somehow make the US feel bad. So yeah, you have to somehow make a huge balance between the two powers. Technologically, this scramble of Antarctica would have a few consequences. Most technology that has to do with rockets, satellites, even long-distance communication would be a decade or two behind. On the other hand, technology dealing with cold temperature, farming within buildings, isolation, and new ways to build sustainable buildings, this technology would be even more advanced than in our timeline. Having people, military and whatnot in Antarctica will be costly, therefore the countries who were trying to own parts of Antarctica will invest in technologies that will also bring the costs very down. Another positive factor will be that most of Antarctica will be better understood and also more explored. In general, the scramble of Antarctica won't really impact geopolitics. More and more people will be sent and will move to Antarctica, primarily military personnel, miners, engineers, scientists, and with the developments of the settlements, we would also have teachers, for instance, moving there, also nurses, spouses of already established workers who would then take other jobs such as shopkeepers or cashier, or even becoming owners of a bar or a restaurant, for instance. Chilean and Argentinian Antarctica would have most inhabitants, followed by the US or the Soviet Antarctica. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet Antarctica would have difficulties to get supplies at first. Moreover, people would not be able to return to their former home country because, well, they would have a lot of troubles getting there, and also the country itself would be almost in a civil war. As a result, Australia, New Zealand and Norway would try to help the Antarctican Russians, but under a few conditions, because help is never for free. In here, the Norwegians and the New Zealanders would push the former Soviet Antarctica to protect more of their lands, to have more ecological regulations, and to facilitate the governments of Antarctica. Soviet, Norwegian and Australian and also the New Zealandian Antarctica would unite. British and French Antarctica would join as well, and even the Chilean and Argentinian and the US Antarctica would join too, but getting some special rights such as exploitations of mines, visa-free access, military bases, etc. So the Chilean, Argentinian and US Antarctica, they would be very special and also probably not totally belong to this new Antarctican Federation, but have some type of shared sovereignty between the US, Argentina, Chile, depending where the borders are drawn, and then also the whole of Antarctica. It will be a very weird and complex situation that we will have. Before the Argentinian crisis, we would see around maybe 100,000 until 500,000 people living in this federal condominium, let's say, of Argentina, of Antarctica. And a condominium means, as I was already mentioning before, like a shared sovereignty or a territory that is shared between two countries. One example is, for instance, Luxembourg and Germany. They have a condominium together over the Mosel, Sauer and even the Ur River. This means that when you have an island or a landmass that is in the river, it does not belong to Luxembourg or to Germany, but it belongs to both. The same is true also for other territories, which I right now don't have in mind, but there was a historical example of Cyprus, for instance, where Byzantium and the Arabs both ruled over Cyprus, but again, that's now just an example. Okay, and after the Argentinian crisis or the economic crisis of 2009, we might see a huge increase in Antarctica's population. The most optimistic number I would put in this ATL 2020 would be 1 million inhabitants for all of Antarctica. And this is the most optimistic number. Most people would work in the construction or mining sector, and probably Latins will be the biggest minority, which would be very weird considering that, we would associate that Latins would more likely live in more warmer regions. But then again, we have Chileans and Argentinians, and I mean, if you live in Patagonia, in Punta Arenas or Ushuaia or Tierra del Fuego, you will have very cold temperatures sometimes, more similar to Scandinavian temperatures or even worse. So we will have a Latin majority because, of course, this former Chilean and Argentinian party would be more developed, while the biggest minority or the second largest group would most likely be the Russians or Russian-speaking people. Why not Americans, you say? Well, if we take Alaska as an example, we had a lot of immigrants like from Germany or from Scandinavia, even Filipinos that lived there. And US Americans themselves, they were not really, well, they are still the biggest group in there, but you have a lot of other groups that come from other countries, whereas when we take the political situation of the Soviet Union, where the Soviets would push the Russians or their population to go there to Antarctica, and also in there you did not really have this immigration from other countries except a few professionals that were allowed to have certain documents to go there, but then they had to go back. That's why the second largest group, they would be most likely Russians. And then you will have Americans, British, Australians, and even French. Space exploration would be less relevant as in OTL, but the technology to keep a population in a hostile environment alive would be definitely much better than in OTL.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.